As you know, I've been New Zealand High Commissioner in Canberra, but it's been some 3 years or so since I completed that role. But I have tried to keep up with what's happening there, and I hope my observations are still broadly valid. But of course they are, my personal observations as well. The introduction to a publication produced by the New Zealand Cartoon Archive in 2001 began with the heading, "Few countries bicker and grizzle about each other more without actually going to war." Now, is that true or not? But my proposition today will actually be that notwithstanding the differences between our two countries, they are actually on a trajectory that inexorably, and some would probably say irrevocably, are bridging those differences. But that doesn't mean that we're doomed to become clones of each other, in fact, far from it. I'm afraid I don't have the time to explore in great detail how the relationship began, so I'll just confine myself to a few general observations. New Zealand was once described by one historian as a, quote, seventh child of the empire, because in the 19th century we were but one of 7 Australasian colonies and had a very high degree of integration with our cousins to the west. Indeed, so close were the links that when serious thought began to be given to federation in Australia, New Zealand participated in the original constitutional convention of the early 1890s, while Western Australia scarcely took part. But when it came to the crunch, Western Australia came inside the tent, while we opted to stay outside. So how different might our past and our future have been had we joined and Western Australia had stood aside? But despite an early history of close contact, for the first 70 years or so after Federation in 1901, wars aside, links between New Zealand and Australia were actually pretty weak. That perception of the Anzac tradition is, however, indelibly strong, and has often been said that both Australia and New Zealand came of age during the Gallipoli campaign. It was a key turning point that transformed us from a bunch of colonials into the independent and self-confident nations that we are today. There is, of course, another view these days that perhaps this is a more after-the-event construct than reality, but never mind. But as we well know, despite our tendency in some quarters on the other side of the Tasman to consider the word Anzac an Australian adjective, the Anzac tradition has a powerful resonance in the contemporary relationship, as indeed it should. But in fact, the occasions in which Australians and New Zealanders have fought side by side over the last 95 years since Gallipoli have been, in fact, relatively few. And so the Gallipoli experience was, in fact, something of an exception, and arguably in historic terms, the kind of integration between our two countries that we see today is a comparably recent development. And to understand that, so let's start by looking at some trade links between our two countries. Until the second half of the 20th century, Australia was not a significant trading partner of New Zealand's. While in the 1960s, the UK was still taking about 50% of our exports, Australia, our closest significant neighbour and a large potential market, took only about 7% of our exports. Though interestingly, at that time, New Zealand was already taking about 20% of Australia's manufactured exports. So in fact, the Australian market was probably much more important to, New Zealand market was much more important to Australia than was probably realised at the time, as it provided a foundation for Australian industry to become increasingly competitive internationally. As you all know, after the UK joined the then EEC in 1972, New Zealand obviously needed to find new markets, and quickly. And while today it's obvious that Australia had to fill at least part of that trade void that had begun to loom, that was less obvious in the 1960s and 1970s. Keith Sinclair, for example, stated categorically as late as 1973 that Australia offered no prospects of any substantial market for New Zealand exports other than possibly timber and paper. But despite such scepticism, Australia was an obvious partner, and we began to step up our economic engagement. An early step was the conclusion in 1965 of the so-called New Zealand-Australia Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA as it was then called. And I say so-called because NAFTA wasn't a free trade agreement at all. It was more of a limited preferential trade arrangement, and it was very mercantilist in orientation. And it should also be recalled that even that very limited movement towards some kind of freer trade links between Australia and New Zealand was fought bitterly by many vested interests on both sides of the Tasman. There's a wonderful quote of Sir John Marshall, the Trade Minister, talking to the Manufacturers Association in Auckland, thanking them enormously for all the efforts they put in to stymie the formation of NAFTA because the Australians were so much easier to negotiate with. But despite the very limited vision embodied in the NAFTA agreement, there were some useful gains for New Zealand. Thus, over the decade to 1976, while Australian exports to New Zealand increased more than 2.5 times, our exports in the other direction increased more than fivefold. 5 years after the UK entered the EEC, Australia and New Zealand signed the Marine Declaration, agreeing to work towards mutual market opening and international competitiveness. This far-sighted decision resulted in the conclusion of the Australia-New Zealand Closer Economic Relations Agreement in 1983. These days, CER is part of the furniture. In fact, so much so, a survey was done about 4 or 5 years ago of business people, and they were asked, what has CER done to your business, done for your business? And the answer of most of them came back, none. And the simple answer was that all these business people had never worked in an environment where they didn't have CER, they just took it for granted. But back in the early 80s, opinion was much more divided, even if it wasn't quite so monolithically negative as it had been 2 decades earlier. Very few such issues get raised today. CER has been a success for both countries. For New Zealand, it has given us almost unfettered access to a market 5 times larger in population terms than our own. And its success rests considerably on the fact that it is comprehensive. There are almost no barriers to trade in goods and services across the Tasman. Virtually any good or service that can legally be sold in one jurisdiction can be sold in the other. Two-way merchandise trade between Australia and New Zealand now stands around $18 billion a year, with trade and services adding around another $9 billion. Two-way investments around $65 billion. And the impact of CER can be seen through the balance of trade. When CER entered into force in 1983, the balance of trade was around 2 to 1 in Australia's favour, while it's now around 1.4, 1.5 to 1 in New Zealand's favour. Australia has been our largest trading partner for quite some time, taking around 1/5 of our exports, although China has very recently displaced it. New Zealand, in turn, is Australia's 5th largest market, and almost half of the foreign direct investment in New Zealand comes from Australia. But the key point really is that CER is a win-win agreement. It creates a common market of over 26 million people for exporters in each country. But the success of CER goes beyond what it does for our exporters in terms of access to the Australian market. It played a key role in the internationalisation of the New Zealand economy in the 1980s and 1990s, as it did for Australia. In both countries, the other is overwhelmingly the first overseas market companies try to expand into. And CER has provided a quality benchmark, a standard, for all other free trade agreements that New Zealand and Australia have subsequently negotiated. And importantly, it has provided the platform for ongoing trade and economic integration between our two countries. Having dealt with barriers at the border, tariffs, quantitative restrictions, import licenses, and so on, both countries are now deeply engaged in dealing with barriers behind the border. And that's occurring in what we call the single economic market process. And the objective is to achieve a seamless business environment so that a company in Auckland, for example, can do business in Sydney as easily as it can in Dunedin, or one in Townsville can operate in Hamilton as easily as in Brisbane. And this involves looking at the transaction costs, the friction, if you like, that companies face in doing business on both sides of the Tasman, especially as a result of different laws and regulations. Increasingly, governments are seeking to ensure the two countries' business laws and regulations are harmonised or aligned. That's not always possible for sound constitutional, political, or environmental reasons. But more and more often the starting point when looking at new legislation or regulation is there any reason why we should not be seeking to harmonise what we're doing? CER was not simply a function of economic self-interest, and we could not sustain its ongoing evolution without a very strong political relationship between ministers and prime ministers, and without other pillars of the relationship being very strong. And one of those other pillars is defence and security cooperation. I've already spoken briefly of the Anzac tradition, but there's always been significant differences between us. For example, the First World War, New Zealand introduced conscription, Australia didn't. Nevertheless, in the post-World War II period, both countries adopted broadly similar approaches to external events, not out of a sense of Anzac solidarity, but rather because of a broadly similar perspective on security issues in the Cold War context. But that very similar worldview came to a dramatic end in the mid-1980s, when the US suspended its security obligations to New Zealand under the ANZUS Treaty in the wake of the passage of our anti-nuclear legislation. The legislation and the US reaction posed some significant issues for Australia too. It's fair to say that Australia didn't really understand why New Zealand chose that course of action and certainly didn't agree with it. But it's equally fair to note that Australia did come to accept the enduring nature of that decision and found ways to maintain a mutually beneficial security relationship with New Zealand. Arguably because of New Zealand's schism with the US, the two countries embarked on a process known as Closer Defence Relations, or CDR. The CDR is a broad arrangement which overarches and brings together a large number of other agreements and arrangements, such as policy, intelligence and security, logistics, and science and technology. A key focus of CDR has been on maximising the ability of our forces to operate effectively together, or what's called interoperability. And this places emphasis on intelligence sharing, harmonising equipment purchase and force structure, and a range of joint activities including doctrine development, planning, exercises, and personnel exchanges. But even so, there's some differences in our approaches to defence and security. Both countries' strategic outlooks are shaped considerably by geography. In New Zealand's case, the predominant feature is isolation, whereas the same can't be said of Australia. For Australia, its most important defence alliance is with the US, whereas for New Zealand, our most important defence alliance is with Australia. Also, New Zealand spends only around half as much as Australia as a proportion of GDP on defence. Geography explains one element of difference that I personally consider to be critically important whenever there's a discussion of our respective defence and security postures. For Australia, its ultimate nightmare is a security one. The bombings of the Australian mainland and the submarine incursions into Sydney Harbour in World War II, coupled with the reality of long, relatively unpopulated coastlines to the west and northwest of the country, and geographical propinquity to not always stable societies to the north, have left their mark on Australia's view of the world. For New Zealand, by contrast, the ultimate nightmare is an economic one. It's one of being unable to trade and earn our way in the world, one of being unable to continue to allow our people to enjoy the standard of living, of education and healthcare to which we all aspire. It's a nightmare of economic marginalisation. That's not to say that defence and security are unimportant. It's certainly not the case. But the relative weight given to these issues and to day-to-day discourse and activities is significantly influenced by geographical isolation. And it doesn't hurt to have a rather great large thumping rock to our left, called Australia. These differences have been summed up by one commentator as same bed, different nightmares. While we both carefully protect our own sovereign interests and identities, the two countries cooperate very closely on a very broad range of foreign policy issues. This reflects a wide range of common interests and values, a high level of trust as well as an appreciation that each can use the other as its ears and eyes as a magnifier of influence. And that's particularly true in the South Pacific, but it's also true in a range of international issues from disarmament and arms control, the liberalisation of international trade, whales, counter-terrorism and UN issues, just to name just a few. Overall, Australia, with its much wider and deeper diplomatic network, is an invaluable diplomatic multiplier for New Zealand. And New Zealand, because of the different texture of some of our bilateral relationships, add values to Australia's diplomatic endeavours. And even where we have shared objectives, we can often be more effective by speaking with different voices. Another key element in the Australia-New Zealand relationship is the movement of people across the Tasman. Under what's known as the Trans-Tasman travel arrangements, New Zealanders and Australians can live and work in each other's country without restriction. That arrangement embodies, if you like, the special nature of the relationship between our two countries. Australia affords no other country that privilege. As you'll be very well aware, there's been increasing comment in New Zealand about alleged discrimination by Australia against New Zealanders who have been long-time residents in Australia. I should just make a couple of comments about that. First, as I've already said, New Zealanders have the unique right of simply deciding to go and live and work in Australia without having to obtain any authority, any approvals from the Australian authorities. Second, of course, every government has the right to determine the conditions under which it will allow other citizens to enter their country. Australia in 2001 decided that the uncontrollable cost of allowing New Zealanders unfettered entry to Australia, a right that included full access to social welfare provisions, was getting too high. It was estimated it would cost Australia about $1 billion a year at that time. This was despite the acknowledged economic and fiscal contributions such migrants brought to Australia. The options the New Zealand government were given were stark. Either the automatic right of New Zealanders to live and work in Australia would have to end, or there would have to be some changes to those conditions. And no New Zealand government would willingly give up the right of New Zealanders being able to go to Australia. So the government of the day opted for that second. And that's how we got to the present situation. It was, however, recognised in 2001 that this arrangement would have to be looked at again as time went on, as there almost certainly would be some unintended consequences, and so it's turned out to be. The reality is that as time since 2001 stretches out, there will be more and more tax-paying New Zealanders who have resided long-term in Australia and have contributed to their local communities. It will become increasingly politically untenable, in my view, for the Australians to continue to deny them full access to social welfare services. There will have to be some path to citizenship introduced in due course. From my experience, many in the Australian system do recognise this, but for the time being, the ongoing fiscal pressures on the Australian government are such that there's clearly no appetite to address the issue right now, but it won't go away. In general, however, the direction of travel is increasingly to reduce or remove barriers between the two countries. The intimacy of contact between the two countries is mirrored in relations at the political level. At the apex is an annual formal meeting between the two Prime Ministers. And sitting beneath or alongside these meetings are other regular structured engagements between the counterparts. Thus, foreign ministers meet twice yearly. Usually defence ministers meet yearly, as do treasurers. And what we call CER ministers, namely Trade, Economic and Agricultural ministers, also meet annually. And these formal structures support a plethora of day-to-day government-to-government encounters undertaken by individual departments and agencies covering virtually every area of activity you can think of. I focus very much on political and governmental linkages, but of course these are but part of the picture. The number of trading, commercial, financial and other business linkages is enormous. It would be very difficult for any of us to track these even if we had a mind to do so. The number of Trans-Tasman companies continues to increase, and companies that see undertaking business in the other jurisdiction as a baseline of their business. There's also a great deal of joint endeavour in the research and development and innovation space. Thus, for example, New Zealand was a founder contributor to the Australian synchrotron, and we're a partner with Australia in a partially successful joint bid to have one of the 21st century global mega science projects, the Square Kilometre Array, located in our part of the world. And finally, of course, I have to mention the connections through sport. In addition to the traditional Trans-Tasman test matches or other contests between national teams, we have not only the Super 15 rugby competition and the Trans-Tasman netball series involving several teams from both countries, but also the New Zealand teams in the A-League, the NDL, the NRL, and so on. I've spoken at some length about the main pillars of the Australia-New Zealand relationship: the economic relationship, the defence relationship, and the people-to-people relationship. I think it's helpful to see them as pillars because they each in their own way hold the relationship up. But let's not forget the other great pillars that are such profound shapers of the relationship and the policies that derive from it. The pillar of values and of course the pillar of interests, the shared stake that we have in each other's security and prosperity. Our encounters with Australia are characterised by an almost total frankness and a focus on key issues. But it's not always sweetness and light. We are, after all, different countries. But overall, that what unites us is so much greater than that which divides us. And that factor, along with the architecture that supports the relationship, provides a context and a mechanism for managing problems. But it's also the case that despite of, or maybe because of, the intimacy and frequency of contact between us, there can be what you call sort of family tetchiness between us from time to time. New Zealanders can be very sensitive to Australian slights or putting down comments, whether intentional or not, and make their views very obvious. As a smaller partner, it's not particularly surprising, but Australians are often taken aback and sometimes offended. The reality is, and this is one that came as some surprise to me when I went there, is that most Australians think very positively of New Zealand and New Zealanders and respect hugely what we have achieved in our much smaller society. The fact that Australians like to beat us on the sports field just as much as we like to beat them is actually a very tangible sign of that respect. In other words, they usually think of us as something approaching an equal and only rarely as a distant, albeit a bit larger, Tasmania. Still happens. I think we're destined to face the challenges of the 21st century very much side by side. Indeed, one of our current ministers likes to describe our aspirations as two countries, one system. To my mind, that's about right. Though equally I believe at any given time there will always be some measures of integration that will be seen by either or both partners as being a step too far. More broadly, economic integration with Australia is likely to continue, and this stems from the simple propositions that New Zealand gains from unfettered access to the Australian market, and that both our countries' interests in the Asia-Pacific region will be advanced more effectively if we have a strong bilateral relationship. I've tried very quickly to give you something of the flavour of how New Zealand's relationship with Australia has developed over the past century and a half. The key point, of course, is that the relationship with Australia lies front and centre for New Zealand. Our future is inextricably bound up with Australia's. Australia too gains by having an increasingly integrated, reliable neighbour. The partnership is very much of one doing better together, but I leave it to you to decide whether we really are two countries, one system. Thank you very much. The short story is that since about 1921 or thereabouts, we were trying to get apples into Australia. You all know the Australian claim we have fire blight, and this is a terrible disease that will race unchecked through the pip fruit industries on the other side of the Tasman. In the end, we took Australia to the WTO. The case came out orderly in our favour, and in theory, access is now allowed. As far as I know, this is something I just haven't caught up with. Very little, if any, trade is yet happening in apples, largely because the particular two supermarket chains, Woolworths and Coles, decided that they would not stock New Zealand apples. So how this is going to develop from here on out, I just don't know. At the risk of making the short answer even longer, one of the series of discussions I had throughout my time in Australia was to convince and talk to state ministers of agriculture and such like that actually, just as Australia tried for years and years to keep the dairy board away from it, now Fonterra is in there, the industry recognises one of the best things ever happened to the Australian dairy industry. And I think exactly the same thing would probably happen if NZA and the New Zealand industry was able to invest and develop apples for Australia. And just a final point, nearly all the apple research, in fact food and vegetable research that's done in Australia is actually done by Hort Research in New Zealand. No guarantee and there's no end game. This is the process, the SEM process is one that is simply incremental. As the two governments, the two countries identify areas where we would do better doing things together, we work on them. But there's no template, there's no particular answer, and my own personal view is that political union is a very long way away, if at all, provided, and this is a big provider, it's always the one safety stop I guess New Zealand has if the economy were totally to collapse, because under the Australian Constitution we still have a right to join Australia. It is actually the ultimate security guarantee that we have, but there's clearly no agenda to get to that point.